in edit mode, there's a pane called histogram here. Histograms will be default in ACDSee in your setup. So you've probably already seen this graph before. Typically, it actually lives just above the AI actions here, right here. And the histogram will be a part of a variety of different tools as well. Let's see if I can give you an example of that. There's certain things like the curves tool, and there's certain like lighting tools that also display the histogram. But the one on the right here is also displayed. And then there will be certain tools that it'll display, like a tone curves, it'll display histogram. So one thing you should know, just from a standpoint of looking at the histogram itself, this will always match the other ones in tool specific. So in terms of develop mode, this histogram matches the distribution from this histogram here. And in edit mode, that is the case as well. So, okay, so those just some locations is where we can find the histogram in edit mode, develop mode, but we don't actually know what this does yet and what it is. And the histogram is ultimately all histograms. I've when dealing in I've worked with a lot of different photo editing softwares, and histograms are often represented in this way. But histogram is really, let's see if I can pull up an example. It's just a graph. At the end of the day, it's just a term to describe a graph. So here's your graph layout. What a histogram does, and we'll reference this image here. It's essentially a graph that shows how much something exists, and that something could be a variety of different elements. But for our purposes, when we're editing images in an editor like ACDSee, it's the frequency of light, right? Light in different variables. So what we're seeing here is a distribution of light. And so what we'll sort of talk about here is how this works and what we're actually sort of seeing from a standpoint of there's two axes on a histogram. There's a vertical axis, so the axis that goes up here, and then there's a horizontal axis, which is the axis that goes from left to right here. On our histogram, the vertical axis is the distribution of the frequency of a certain degree of light. And with that light comes a certain number that's associated with it. One of the things we can see here is that we have these sort of three check marks that appear on the bottom left here. And so what we're seeing is a combination of red values, green values, and blue values that are displayed at the same time, right? And so when I do that, you can see that, so I have these three values that are displayed in these sort of like almost waveform like structures that run from left to right. These values have different, what would be the word for it? It has a different extent. So certain values have a longer extent than others because they have a more horizontal digital numbers than the other one. And so when you see, for example, this is a really good example of this. There's looks like there's less red values in our composition here than there are green, because as I add green, you can see that this red value is shifted then to the left, and that goes the case for blues as well. And we'll get to sort of what this is saying in a moment here. But what we're determining is that there is, in this histogram, we're having a visualization, the distribution of light. And you can see that the way that we visualize this light is by using like RGB values. And then finally, I believe I also have a combination in this case, which is just, brightness, right? So brightness distributions. Okay, so from a vertical perspective, so it's the amount of something that we're seeing. And then from a horizontal perspective, it's a variable, so some degree of change in a particular item here. So if we actually, what would be the best way to do this? Here's a good way of doing this. So here's our image here. I think this might have been a different image, but either way, it has a histogram representation. Um, there's this slider that appears right here that runs horizontally from left to right in our image. And what this slider here depicts is uh, brightness starting at blacks, which appear here. So these are our blacks, and our blacks run, range basically in this area right here. And then what we have is the beginning of our what we would describe as shadows, and they run about EA right there. So those would be our shadow ranges, and you can see that on the histogram itself, that is actually depicted on this bar here. You can start to see those values become gray, right? These this to me, this is these sort of values of blacks and shadows. These can be longer or shorter. I'm just sort of doing the best job to depict what I'm seeing here. Then in the center here, we have our midtones. So this range right here is our midtones. That's what we're seeing. And then we finally have the opposite of that, which is our what we call highlights. So our highlights are represented here. And then finally, we have our whites, which are represented here at the very end. Forgive my crude graph, but this depicts what we're seeing. So in this range, the very end of our spectrum, we're seeing the whites. And so if we correlate that information to what we're seeing above here, we're seeing that, oh, well, this is actually some really valuable information. We're seeing that there is a fair amount of red values that are present within this like far, far, far end of our spectrum, these whites. Vice versa, if we go to our blacks here, we can see that there's actually blacks present in the blue spectrum of light here, in the sense that there is very dark colors within that spectrum of light present at the bottom of the graph. And these have a high degree of distribution versus the green and red, which we can see are quite low in that range. As we go up, as we start to enter the midtones, that's where we're going to see a sort of a even distribution of all these colors, and that would be fairly standard in most images, unless it's depicting a scene that's like at night or depicting a scene that has like a high degree of light in it. And I mean light from a light source in that case. Again, our highlights here are depicted here, and then yeah, like I said, our brights. So when we're looking at the histogram, we're seeing a distribution of light. In this case, the light is graphed using red, green, and blue values. And then it has the sort of degree of brightness that those values are illustrated at. So we have a way of depicting light in our image at varying degrees, and the distribution or the presence of that light. So what we're going to do is let's have a look at some photos and like reference the histograms themselves. So this is, I believe, this histogram from this image right here. Let me just double check that. Yes, that's the case. Okay, so we have a distribution here. It looks like a relatively even distribution with generally, pardon me, quite a bit of midtones here. But our image is certainly brighter than it is dark, and we can see that distribution is reflected here. So already we can see that there is a lot of blues in the highlights, and that would make sense because this image depicts the sky. So there's going to be, and if we actually reference our histogram here, so I'll just shrink this for a moment here, that makes sense because 2/3 of our image here are predominantly blue. And so if we were to take something like our color picker, our eyedropper here, and we're to hover over a blue in our image here, we can see that this particular pixel that I have highlighted, right, has a higher amount of blue. It actually has a pretty high green value, which is depicted in our histogram here as well. You can see that our green values are quite high. And then it has a sort of moderate or lower value. I guess in this case, a truly saturated, middling saturation red value. And then the bottom just depicts the overall light value. So a black color, a black value would be 0, right? And a fully white color would be 255. In a histogram, and in 8-bit imagery, that would leave 256 values of brightness. So once again, we can actually track this. So approximately this area is around 170 to 180 range. 255 would be this absolute extent, right? This value at the very, very end here. So roughly speaking, what we're looking at is in this range, right? This is about the 170 to 180 range. Oops. So when we're seeing that, it's actually corresponding very nicely to what we're seeing in our histogram here. So if we were to look at a different part of our image, what would we see? Well, if we were to hover over one of these central parts here, well, that's truly white here in this case. But if we're to look at this tan, this taupe color that we're seeing right here, the values change, right? So the values are actually quite even, it looks like. So the values are 168 red, so 168 appears to be the highest, 155 for green, and 136 for blue. So these values, again, we can track this on the histogram. This is sort of visualized to us on the histogram, and with a sort of medium brightness. So this would be sort of here on our histogram right here from a brightness perspective. And I'm sort of going to try to find approximately the same color, but it was this kind of color. So higher red values, lower green values, but almost equal, and a fair amount of blue values. So I'm guessing that's right here on the histogram. That value is represented right about here. So about 150 on our brightness, and then we can track sort of, well, these 3 blue, green, and red values are roughly equivalent, so it's probably within this general range. So does that make sense so far in how I can literally look at a pixel in my image and sort of track where it is in relation to our histogram? Yeah, does that make sense? Can I sort of reiterate anything to assist with this? This histogram represents this image in that we can see a certain depiction of blues and greens. Based on this color picker tool, we can sort of track where those parts of our images are. You can see that the distribution overall, thank you so much, guys. That's awesome. I just want to make sure that this is making sense as I'm going through. You can see that the distribution of this image definitely tends to lean towards bright. It's brighter rather than it is dark. Although that being said, it does appear that our brightest values look like they might be lower than our darkest values, but our spectrum overall lives in the midtones and the highlights. That's sort of where this image lives. Let's look at a different image and compare it. Let's look at a different image and see what we can find. Okay, different image. Let's go to panes and histogram again. Okay, this is a pretty standard curve, or almost a standard curve rather. This image is interesting in that it appears on both ends. There does not appear to be that many blacks or whites. It very much appears to live predominantly within the sort of brights, shadows, and midtones in this image. And then let's have a look at some pixels and see if we can track them on the histogram here. So if we were to take our color picker again, and we just have a look at our brights here. So this is quite interesting. You can see that the peaks for not only in this case reds, but also greens and blues are all about 220 or within the 200 range. Again, a true white would be depicted as 255. So we can track these values on our histogram. We can see that, okay, well, 255 would be here, which would mean that 220 would be roughly around here. And then if we're looking at any individual value, we can probably guess that it would be around this range right here. This spike where we see the blue and green values sort of merge with these red values that are just underneath it here. Versus a value like this one, this 13, right? So these sort of darker values in this range right here would probably be represented, in this case, somewhere around here, right? This range would be about 14. So what we're seeing here is this histogram, again, it's displaying a distribution of a certain value. So if we're thinking about this image, because an image is fundamentally a series of digital numbers that represent an individual pixel, okay? And that pixel has information. So if we're seeing this image that's this beautiful image of what appears to be, I think, Porto in Portugal, but if we can think about the image in a little bit more almost a more binary sense, these pixel values have numbers associated with them, and they're trackable, and they're represented in this way. So when we see these dark values, if we look at our image, we can see sort of similar values in these windows here, and these values are all sort of roughly equivalent, these sort of dark values. And it's going, okay, well, Adam, there's not a huge distribution of these dark windows in my image here, but there's some. And so they're present in this range. Versus, hey, Adam, there's a bunch of these pixels of these orange roofs here. Those are sort of referenceable in a different area, and we can track those as well. Let's see here. So this one is 231 red, so high red to low green, and even lower blue. So this value with about 169 brightness, my guess would be probably in this range right here. Marvast, are we able to see the horizontal numbers on the histogram? Well, you are. These are visualized to you. So, so you mean like would there be like incrementally numbers here? Yeah, that's an interesting question. The answer to that is no, because there's no room for that to be visualized in the user interface. And so what I mean by that, Marv, is when we go to like program what this histogram looks like, it's very hard to fit in a series of numbers, in this histogram here. But maybe what would be useful and something that I would maybe recommend to the developers is just a toggle where it shows like 0, 155, 255. So we get that value there. But I can show you why I say this is 255 and this is 0. I can show you that right now. It's actually quite easy to illustrate. So I'm just going to open up this color picker here. To do that, I just clicked on the foreground color. And if I go to custom, custom is a way actually of visualizing sort of the way the light is represented in an image. And you can see that I can describe how this sort of represents the histogram here as well. So the histogram is representing light to us, right? And it's giving us a digital number that corresponds to a degree of saturation, brightness, and I guess we're displaying hue in this way in these sort of three broad red, green, and blue spectrums here. The foreground color picker will show us some really interesting information. You can see that my controller here, my little nib pointer at the very, very bottom is set to the bottom left-hand corner, Marv. And so this corner has a corresponding red, green, blue value, a hex code value, and then importantly, and I think easiest to understand, is a value called HSB, which refers to hue, saturation, and brightness. So HSB is the way that we can really easily understand the placement of a color and our distribution of color from that 8-bit number value that I mentioned, which starts at 0 and goes to 255, with a total of inclusive 256 digital numbers. So if I increase this all the way to the top right-hand corner, I'm seeing some information here. So I see that the hue value of red has a corresponding number. This is going to be less important for what we're describing here, but you can see that that number is 0. So in this case, red is just depicted as 0. But we get some really important information when it comes to saturation and brightness. So saturation, you can see that this red is fully saturated, and you can see that that is depicted using that 255, so that maximum value. What this indicates to us is that it has full saturation and that it has essentially full brightness to it as well, which is visualized underneath. If I was to take that same value, the hue value of 0, but in this case I was to pull this slider all the way down, you can see that this value that I'm seeing here has a brightness of 0, so it's fully black. It's fully saturated, and it is still the hue of red, in this case, the value or the sort of code of 0 here. But if we were to change the hue, let's say we'll change it to blue, you can see that that blue value has a corresponding number to it. So in this case, this value is 167. So that's what we consider blue. And then it has a full saturation once again and a full brightness. And if I slide this down, it'll have it'll be fully black. Now, so that depicts the vertical axis here. And if I was to slide this value to the left, you can see that the saturation changes while the color and the brightness are maintained. So as I slide that down, that saturation becomes 0 saturation. And if I put it in the center, it'll be around, I don't know, 135 or something like that. So when I'm looking at these, they also correspond to an RGB value. So this particular color, Marv rather, has a red value of 120, a green value 130, and a blue value in 255. And so if we were to place this in our image here, I would be able to say that, okay, my red value is lower, so it would be within this range. My green value is slightly higher, and my blue value is the highest. So if I was to find a color like this, it would probably exist within a spectrum that looked like this at the corresponding brightness value. In this case, we don't know the brightness value, but it would look something like this in our histogram. So what I'm trying to point out to you, and what I sort of am illustrating by opening up the color picker here, is that when I say that 255 is the maximum value in essence fully bright, that corresponds also to what we see in this graph right here on a histogram, in that a value of 255 is up top here, and then a value of 0 would be at the very bottom here. Okay, so I think does anyone have any lasting questions in regards to the histogram? And if you don't have time to type them out, just I can get to these questions at the end, or I can get to them later. But I just do want to stop to ask to make sure that if anyone has any questions, we cover that. But now that we sort of understand what the histogram is depicting, this is a huge deal. Let's talk about two different things that I think we'll talk about first, sort of some misnomers, I suppose, about the histogram. And then we'll talk about like how the histogram changes when we use tools. So there's a kind of a classic, when it comes to photography, there's kind of like a classic rule of thumb, or a heuristic, that you want a mountain-like curve on your histogram. Yeah, of course I can. So in edit mode, the histogram will probably be default when you open the editor, but if you always go to panes, histogram will appear here, and you can use panes or F7 to open it up, and then from there you can dock it pull it over to above the AI actions and it'll sit there. I just have it pulled out so we can better visualize it right now. So there's a kind of long running, what would be the word for it? Let's use the snipping tool to show this. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized I don't have my mouse highlight on. I'll turn that on. That'll be better. Probably easier to see now. So there's this long running sort of narrative, and I think there's broadly some truth to this, but that you want your histogram to look like this in your images. That a good distribution in your image will always represent or look like some form of mountainous curve in your image. And so if we actually talk about what that curve would look like, right? That would indicate to us that we have low low values in the sort of blacks, with increasing values in the shadows. Predominantly, all of our values are in the midtones, with again sort of a degree of decreasing, in this case, highlights, and then virtually zero whites. Now, why do people say this? Well, the reason why they say this is because they're trying to avoid, when you capture an image, they're trying to avoid something called, I guess, having their image blown out, right? And I guess what I mean by that is, so if we crank the exposure way down, so I pulled the exposure way down, way down, you can see that the depiction on my histogram changes, right? The distribution is pulled way into the blacks. The whole curve itself, right, from start to finish, is shrunk. I'll show that here. So previously we had values that lived in this area right here. And what we did is we collapsed those values into the shadows, and we pulled as much of this into the blacks as we could, right? Versus, let me show that again. So this is our default image. Versus if we were to do the opposite, and we were to pull our exposure way into the highlights, we could see again a histogram that looks super different. Tons of white values here, lots of highlights, but our curve is just huge and it's a total mess. And there's way too much committing to whites in this image. So there's way too many values that fall under that 255, 255, 255. This tells us information about the image. Obviously, when I hover over with my color picker, you can see that that value is now fully white. Now, if I wasn't actively editing this image, and if I had taken an image like this, that had the corresponding histogram that looks something like what we're seeing right here, or inversely, if I was to see an image that had a exposure that looks something like this, right? We would have a histogram that is skewed in a certain direction, in the sense that the histogram is skewed either right or left towards the blacks or the whites correspondingly. So what happens when we have full blacks in our image? This image actually is a lot brighter than it was dark. So when I pulled the exposure way down, it actually didn't, I didn't lose a lot of information in this image. Excuse me. But when I did the inverse of that, when I pulled the exposure way up, the image became super washed out, right? When an image is washed out like this, we're actually losing detail in our image, because detail is typically experienced in those midtones, the area of our saturation where we have values of variation in color, right? And the way that our eyes see color. So those reds and those greens and those blues have differing values. They aren't just all 255, 255, 255, and 255, which means I'm just seeing white, right, in this case. So when we take a photo we're not taking a photo of pure light. We're taking a photo of the way that we see light with all this nuance and the way that the light plays in the space, and that we see the variations in color and in darkness, and and the ways that an image colors may be grayer. And so what I'm saying is that when we have a histogram distribution that is skewed in one direction or the other, we're typically losing information. Now, huge caveat, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a bad image. So when people say that they want you want a histogram to have this beautiful mountainous curve that exists in the center here, this is a rule of thumb to teach beginners when it comes to image or taking photography, right? Because they want you to have lots of values that exist that can have beautiful contrast and high saturation, and we can see these colors and they're depicted well, blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that subjectively speaking that that is a better image. And there's always going to be examples of images that are like have so much light in them but still depict a setting extremely well. And they might blow out a certain portion of the image and lose a bunch of values there, but there's still something, there's a narrative being told, and there's still a subjective quality that's of merit to an image. So when I say that, generally speaking, histograms, you kind of want to look like this curve here, take that with a huge grain of salt. And you're going to be the eye when you take these photos that is going to be acknowledging those values. But the cool thing about this curve idea is, let's give a different example here. Let's just erase all these. Sometimes the value of a curve isn't necessarily perfectly depicted in the center of your histogram, but rather it's depicted in those edges. So we can take that curve foundation that we've described, and instead of it being, hey, the curve is perfectly in the center here, what the curve wants to be, where the curve wants to be, is there's a curve like this in the edge of our image, or maybe set up in such a way that it's depicted like that or something like that on the edge of our image. That's, in this case, our image might be very dark and our distribution is in the shadows area, but there's beauty in our image because we subjectively took something that really wanted to play in that space, or vice versa, an image that had a lot of highlights. So the whole point and the caveat about talking about the histogram distribution of maybe just your image prior to any edits is that, yeah, they might not be they might not be a classic sort of one size fits all curve distribution like that. They might not look like that, and that's okay, because in the end of the day, when we're looking at an image, that might be something that we're going for. We might be going for an image that has like really, really strong whites and they take up a huge portion of our image, but we're still telling a narrative or a story. So now when we look at this image, that's obviously not the case, right? Like when I just blow out the exposure on my image and I crank it up and all of these values are really, really bright, you can see that that's unintentional. And in this case, it just looks like we took the photo improperly, or we've done here something in post that ruined the image, right? So there's rules to these that can be broken, and there's also rules like I'm describing that are really useful for displaying information. So hopefully, to come back to the point of that, what I'm saying here is that when we have true whites that have very, very high red, green, and blue values, or inversely, if we have really, really dark values in our image that are closer to 0, we can firmly say that we are losing information when we're editing this image, because there's less variation between greens, blues, and reds in that case. However, we just want to be mindful of that curve distribution of the histogram does matter. And that it shows us valuable information about our image. Okay, so what we've covered is we've shown so far where the histogram is, how to access it. We've shown literally how the histogram works, what it's depicting, sort of from a vertical perspective on a vertical axis and the horizontal axis. We've correlated that information to sort of how the color picker works, and we've shown how we can actually isolate a part of our image and directly tell well, not directly, but like approximate where that color is, that pixel is on our histogram distribution. And then we've talked about, I don't know, general curves and sort of like what we want our image to look like. Now, I guess the thing to talk about would be to acknowledge, like, let's look at a histogram, and let's make some adjustments to an image and talk about what changes when we edit our image. Let's open up an image that I think is arguably bad, and we'll talk about adjusting it. I think it might be this image here. Yes, this image is really dark. Okay. Histogram. So here we are. Here's our image here of a gas station on a street. And we can see that on our histogram, we have a distribution that correlates to what I'm seeing here. So lots and lots of blacks. We have a lot of highlights here that are in this sort of region, which are depicted on this end of the histogram. And we sort of a general lower amount of saturated values in the midtones. So let's tuck this over here, and we'll make some adjustments to our image here. Let's tuck that down. There we go. Actually, I don't even know if I need this. Let's move this down here. There we go. That's better. So when we make adjustments to our image, this histogram is going to actively change as we adjust our image, right? It's gonna change with the image. So if I do something like change the exposure, right, like we were showing earlier, if I increase that exposure, let's see here. This is the distribution before, and then we're pulling those values away from the dark end of the spectrum towards the brighter end of the spectrum. So we're essentially shifting all of these values over. That might not actually be a nice change for our image, though. So we might want to change our image using different tools. From a like a subjective perspective, I don't really love the way that changes the image. But if we were to go to something like curves and just pull, I don't know, some values up. Let's pull their blacks up. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Pull these values up into the grays. So now we're sort of forcing these forcing these values to have to not be black, right? We're forcing them into the sort of the gray end of the spectrum. And we can see that that corresponds also with how we see our histogram here. So you can see that those values have now shifted and moved away from the 0 end of the spectrum, and they've moved towards the 255. But now that there's basically a 22 values there that we've just removed from our composition entirely. So those black values I've shifted so that it starts at the value of probably around 22 to 30 range. You can see that's depicted here in our composition. Now, if we wanted to add light to our midtones here, maybe we do something like add a light EQ, and we would increase the values in our midtones using something like this tool. Let's see here if actually, I think the best way to do this would be to just do it using the actual light EQ tool in the filter menu here, which I'll show right now. So if I wanted to pull the midtones up, I would use something like this, where I could pull those midtones up, and you can see that they increase in brightness as I pull that slider up. Or I could pull the shadows up slightly or the highlights up slightly, and that adjusts those values. I might pull the highlights down. Let's see what's attractive here, what my eye just gravitates to. I want to pull a bit of more light into the midtones to the shadows. The shadows definitely don't need to be darker. So around that, we'll see how the histogram changes in correspondence. So let's have a look. So the histogram now is, yeah, it's depicting roughly the same. We sort of shifted those values. There's not too much we can push into this area without sort of losing the natural curve that we have here. But maybe if we add a vibrancy adjustment to my image here, we'll see how that affects the histogram as well. Some of those red values might be a bit brighter. As you can see, as I increase the saturation, more of those red values are shifted into that region. Oops. You can see them move over as I slide it. So the histogram is very much like a living entity. Um, as I'm adjusting these values, I'm seeing those colors change in real time. Let's see here. That's way too saturated. So probably something more like that would be the move. But now if I was to hover over those values, right? Let's see here, one of these oranges, you can see that the red value here is 250 versus if we remove that saturation, 240. So I increased the value of that saturation in the red there by about 10. So by a factor of 10, now it's about, 240. So those values have gone up in correspondence with my saturation increase. So the histogram is very much live. It changes as you change these images. As you can see here, all I've really done to this image, I took our shadows completely out of the blacks. And then I added like a very, very gentle curve on our image here. And then I added a vibrancy adjustment. And then all I did was do a slight midtones increase on that image. And all of that corresponds to what we see in the histogram here. I'm not sure why it's depicting these dips. I mean, the curve is generally as you see it here. I'm not quite sure why it's depicting those dips. That might actually be just a digital error, honestly. I think the development team have talked about this in the past, but also when we're shifting exposure over, there is peaks and valleys in the natural exposure of an image, and maybe it's just exaggerating those peaks and valleys, which I'm seeing here. But there's clearly doesn't appear to be any like massive drop offs in digital number values or distribution frequency in these ranges. Like I'm not seeing any disruption here. So this to me reads as almost like a slight visual error or something like that that's appearing as I adjust the image. But the overall shape and curve and distribution of the histogram is what matters here, and that's very much preserved. Yeah, that covers pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about today. A cool 50-minute workshop today. Does anyone else have any other questions in relation to the histogram? Anything that you'd like me to cover that I didn't? Yeah, all ears, want to hear what you have to say. But that sort of covers histograms from a perspective of so like where they are in the user interface, how you interact with them, what the histogram is, how it works, what it does, what it means, and how it relates to the colors you're seeing in image, how we can visually find those colors using the histogram. We talked a little bit about curve distribution and why that sometimes matters, but subjectively might not matter for your image. And then we talked about watching the histogram sort of change and move and shift as you actually make edits and changes to your image. So that sort of covers everything that I wanted to talk about. But hopefully what this workshop does is it showcases the absolute power of the histogram, and it illuminates to you that this isn't just a weird thing that exists in the corner of your user interface. It's hugely important and depicts like so much information about your picture and your image that is really valuable and you can use over and over and over again. And you can sort of just almost see an image just by looking at a histogram distribution. You can sort of see the layout and structure of an image. Um, I enjoyed your manipulation of curve and light EQ. Yeah, it's subtle. Whenever I'm doing curves, the standard curve that I like to do in an image, one that I find that it definitely facilitates a nice adjustment for most images is just a standard S curve. So you pull the like a really subtle. Obviously, this isn't going to work for a black image, a darker image here, but you'd want to darken the shadows and highlight pull in the highlights. But for an image like this that has so many dark portions of it here, all I did was I sort of mimicked that, but I pulled uh, the blacks into the shadows, which gives you this sort of rich kind of almost yeah, a somber sort of gray tone to it that is can be really attractive in an image like this. And then just pulling up the highlights a little bit. So not an S curve, but very much more useful for an image that features much more darks and blacks, shadows and blacks in your image. Okay, James asked, what about when converting to black and white, adjust before or after? What do you mean, James? Just to be clear. So when you convert an image to black and white, I wouldn't, you don't necessarily need to convert an image in when you're editing in an ACDSee. You can just use the black and white tool. You certainly can convert it if you'd like, but there's also ways of manipulating black and white in an image just using that tool. Um, I'd recommend not converting to black and white because you lose before you edit. Because you lose the ability to adjust like values like red, green, and blue in an image, which can change the way that your black and white is depicted. So convert as you're editing rather than like do like a conversion by what's the word for it? Saving down your image as like a black and white image. Maybe the way to go would be to use the like a tool like this, so we actually preserve those values, and then we're working a little bit more non-destructively. Scott asked, in the current photo, would it make sense to first select the sky or background first using AI, invert the selection, and make it? Yes, 100%. Yeah. Um, so what Scott's suggesting is, hey, wouldn't it make more sense to edit the midtones, or sorry, edit the shadowy parts of our image and preserve the highlights and these sort of beautiful color that we see in the sky? And absolutely, I'm not suggesting that what I showcase to you is the best way to edit an image. I was only trying to illustrate that when I make exposure curve adjustments, or vibrancy adjustments, the histogram changes in correspondence with that. No, not so much a best case scenario for editing this image, but rather just showcasing how the histogram works. But yeah, if you were in Scott's position, I would definitely do something similar to that. And maybe for fun, we'll just quickly showcase what that would look like. So if I was in Scott's position and I said, hey, I want to see how the histogram works, but I want to preserve the sky in my image, I would select it using an AI tool. And it's going to do a pretty good job. And then what I would do is I would probably, I don't even know if I want to select inverse yet. I'll make a duplication of my image. Then I will go inverse my selection. And then maybe something that I would want to do here is I would want to make a filter adjustment of this foreground area, or maybe something like maybe like a levels adjustment. And so this levels adjustment is going to be focusing predominantly on my shadows here. And so I would then pull some light into the shadows. And as you can see, that's only affecting uh, yeah, it's only affecting um, the bottom portion, the shadows in my image here. And is all I'm really doing is you could see in this distribution, what I would be doing is I'd be shifting the whites here to represent a larger portion of my image. So I'm moving those values into the midtones here and the shadows that are affected by these darker colors. So if I do the inverse of that, right, you can see how that affects what it would look like on the histogram here. I'm allowing for there to be more values within that spectrum, within that, I'm pulling the blacks even further to the right versus, excuse me, pulling the sort of highlights and whites into the midtones here to brighten this area. And then I would just probably do the same thing I did before, which is just to do a slight, take those grays out of the, yeah. There we go. So if I was to take Scott's feedback, but seriously, that's not probably closer to what I would do. This preserves all these nice values in the sky, which are kind of the feature of our image that we like, and then completely just changing the foreground in my image here. You know, that would be the move. Thanks for that. Does anyone else have any questions before I? Oh, I have a question from Antoine here. Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, Anton, in regards to just from a light brightness perspective. We did touch on that at the start. We were talking about the fact that the histogram also just represents brightness, right? So if we take away the sort of red, green, and blue values and just talk about light distribution in our image, you can see that that light distribution represents the same of what I see here, which is predominantly shadows in my image, midtones, and a little bit of bright features, which are sort of represented in the lights and the sky here. But yeah, I think that this is useful for sure, depicting. But also, I think the most people engage with an image from in a color image, and so maybe from a perspective of editing an image, it's also useful to go over both. Does anyone else have any other questions?